Some places don't just feel old, they feel like they were built with something we don't fully understand. A city carved entirely from rock, a stepwell descending in perfect symmetry, massive structures made from earth that still stand when they shouldn't. These aren't myths, they were built, used, and then left behind. In this video, we're exploring ancient structures that still raise questions, not because they're unknown, but because parts of how they were built, and why, still don't fully make sense. And before we begin, tell me where you're watching from, and what time it is right now. And if this kind of mystery pulls you in, make sure to subscribe. They feel like something we're still trying to understand. The massive mud brick tower that shouldn't still exist. At first, it doesn't look like something that should have lasted. A massive structure built not from stone, not from materials we associate with permanence, but from mud brick, shaped earth, dried and stacked. Something that should erode, collapse, and disappear over time. But this one didn't. It's still here, rising above the landscape. This is the Kerma de Fufa. And what makes it stand out isn't just its size, but the fact that a structure like this still exists at all, because mud brick, by nature, is temporary, vulnerable to rain, wind, and time. And yet this structure remains. That contrast is where everything begins. The form itself is irregular, not perfectly symmetrical, not cleanly shaped like later monumental buildings. Instead, it feels layered, almost organic, as if it grew over time rather than being completed in a single phase. And that's likely what happened, because structures like this were not built all at once. They were expanded, reinforced, modified, layer by layer, and each layer adds to its mass. The surface tells part of that story. Different textures, subtle shifts in color, sections that appear slightly different from others, suggesting phases of construction, moments where the structure was repaired or extended. And that continuity matters, because it shows this wasn't abandoned early. It remained important. For a long time, the scale begins to change how you perceive it, because from a distance it looks like part of the land. But as you move closer, the height becomes clear. It rises above everything around it, dominating the flat terrain. And that elevation is not accidental, because height creates visibility. It creates presence. It separates what's happening inside from everything outside. And that separation suggests purpose. The interior is not empty. There are spaces within, rooms, passages, areas that indicate this wasn't just a solid mass, but a structure designed to be used. And that adds another layer, because now it's not just about size, it's about function. The exact function, though, is not completely preserved. Some interpretations connect it to ceremonial or ritual use. Others suggest administrative or communal roles. But no single explanation fully defines it. And that uncertainty is part of the structure, because it leaves room for interpretation. The material itself continues to stand out. Mud brick. Simple, common. But when repeated at this scale, it becomes something else entirely. Because millions of small units, placed together over time, create something that feels permanent, even if each individual piece is not. And that transformation is important, because it shows how scale changes meaning. What seems temporary becomes lasting. The construction process would have required coordination, planning, labor over extended periods, because building upward with this material requires consistency, alignment, maintenance. And that level of effort reflects organization, because this is not accidental construction. It is controlled. The relationship between the structure and its environment also matters, because it doesn't sit randomly. It exists within a broader settlement, connected to other spaces, part of a larger system. And that integration shows that it had a role, not isolated, but central. The erosion over time has changed its appearance. Edges softened, surfaces worn, but enough remains to understand its original scale, to see how large it once was, and how much effort it required. And that persistence is what keeps it relevant, because even in its altered state, it still dominates the landscape, still defines space, still draws attention. There's also a contrast here that's hard to ignore, because we often associate durability with stone, with materials that resist time. But this structure challenges that idea, because it shows that even materials considered temporary can become lasting, if used in the right way at the right scale. And that shifts perspective, because it changes how we think about construction, about permanence, about what survives. Even now the Dafufa stands, weathered, reduced from its original form, but still present, still visible from a distance, still holding its shape, and still raising questions, not just about what it was used for, but about how something like this was built to last this long in the first place. And maybe that's what makes it stand out. Not just its size, not just its form, but the contradiction it represents. A structure made from earth that refused to disappear, and that contradiction is what remains. The stone tower built with perfect balance. At first, it looks like a tower. A solid mass of dark stone rising from the ground, circular in shape, thick, compact, with an entrance that seems small compared to the scale of the structure itself. But the longer you look, the more precise it begins to feel. Because this is not random stacking. This is controlled construction. This is nuragelosa. And what makes it stand out is not just its form, but how it holds itself together. Because the entire structure is built from large stones placed without mortar, relying entirely on weight and balance and positioning. And that changes everything. The outer walls are thick, layered, each stone placed in a way that supports the next, creating a structure that distributes weight downward and outward, maintaining stability without any binding material. And that kind of construction requires understanding. Because there is no margin for error, the shape is circular, and that is not just visual, it is structural. Because circular forms distribute pressure more evenly, reducing weak points, allowing the tower to maintain integrity over time. And that choice reflects knowledge, because it shows that the builders understood how form affects strength. The entrance is low, narrow, forcing movement to slow down, to adjust posture, creating a controlled access point that separates the outside from the inside. And that control is intentional, because entrances define how space is used. Inside, the structure changes completely, because the interior is not solid, it opens upward. A central chamber that rises into a domed ceiling, created by gradually overlapping stones inward until they meet at the top. And that construction technique is precise, because each layer must be placed carefully to maintain balance, to ensure that the structure supports itself. And that method reflects advanced understanding, because creating a dome without support requires planning. The interior walls are smooth compared to the exterior, shaped, adjusted, creating a space that feels enclosed but stable, controlled rather than rough. And that contrast adds depth, because it shows that the builders treated interior and exterior differently. There are additional spaces connected to the main chamber, passages, secondary rooms, stairways built within the thickness of the walls, allowing movement upward without disturbing the main structure. And that internal complexity adds another layer, because it shows that the design was not simple, it was intentional. The stairways are narrow, spiraling upward, integrated into the wall itself, creating a path that leads to higher levels, suggesting that the structure was meant to be used vertically as well as horizontally. And that vertical movement is important, because it adds function beyond a single chamber. The stones used are large, heavy, irregular in shape, yet fitted together in a way that creates a stable surface, showing that each piece was adjusted to fit with the others. And that fitting process reflects skill, because it requires shaping, positioning, understanding how each stone interacts with the rest. The placement of the structure within the landscape also matters, because it stands alone, elevated enough to be visible, creating a presence that extends beyond its immediate surroundings. And that visibility suggests purpose, because structures that stand out are meant to be seen. the exact function of Nuraghe Losa is still discussed. Because while the structure is clearly built for use, whether defensive, residential, ceremonial, or a combination, is not fully defined, and that uncertainty adds depth because it shows that form does not always reveal complete function. The durability of the structure is also significant, because despite being built without mortar, it remains intact, showing that the method of construction was effective, that balance and weight can create long-lasting stability. And that challenges assumptions, because it shows that binding materials are not always necessary. Even now, the tower stands, its walls still intact, its chamber still accessible, its form still clear, allowing it to be observed, entered, experienced, and that persistence keeps it relevant, because it provides direct evidence of how such structures were built. The contrast between simplicity and complexity defines this structure, because from the outside it appears simple, a stone tower, but inside the design reveals itself. Layers, passages, movement, structure, and that shift changes understanding. And maybe that is what makes Nuraghe Losa stand out, not just because it still stands, but because of how it stands, balanced entirely by its own construction, a structure that holds itself together through design alone. Stone placed on stone, weight supporting weight, form creating stability, and that balance is what remains. The tombs carved directly into the rock. At first they don't look like structures. There are no walls rising from the ground, no visible buildings standing above the landscape, only openings cut into rock, small entrances that lead into spaces hidden beneath the surface. And that hidden nature is what defines them, because these are not built outward, they are carved inward. These are the domus de Janus. And what makes them stand out is not just their presence, but how they were created. Because instead of assembling materials, the builders removed them, shaping solid rock into chambers, corridors, and spaces that exist entirely within the stone itself. And that approach changes everything. The entrances are small, often simple, cut directly into the rock face, creating a transition point between the outside world and the interior, a boundary that separates open space from enclosed space. And that transition is deliberate, because it controls movement. The interior spaces are more complex than expected. Multiple chambers, connected rooms, carved walls that define areas within the rock, creating layouts that suggest planning rather than simple excavation. And that planning reflects intention, because shaping rock requires foresight. You cannot easily correct mistakes. The surfaces inside are smooth in many areas, worked, refined, indicating that tools were used to shape the rock carefully, creating spaces that are not rough cavities, but controlled environments. And that refinement reflects skill, because it shows that the builders understood how to shape solid material. The ceilings vary, some flat, others slightly curved, following the natural structure of the rock while still maintaining the intended form of the space. And that variation reflects adaptation, because it shows that the builders were working with the material rather than against it. The layout of the chambers often suggests division, separate areas within the tomb, indicating that the space was organized, possibly to hold multiple remains or to separate different elements within the structure. And that organization adds complexity, because it shows that the design was functional. The connection between chambers is also intentional. Passages carved to link spaces, creating movement within the structure, guiding how the interior is navigated. And that guidance reflects planning, because it shows that the builders considered how the space would be used. The identification of these structures as tombs comes from what has been found within, evidence that connects them to burial practices, indicating that these spaces were used to hold remains. And that function adds meaning, because it shows that the structure is tied to memory. The number of these tombs across the landscape is also significant, because they are not isolated. They appear in groups, clusters, suggesting that this was not a single construction but a repeated practice, a system that extended across the region. And that repetition reflects continuity, because it shows that the method was sustained over time. The placement of the tombs often follows natural rock formations, cliffs, outcrops, areas where the rock's accessible, indicating that the location was chosen based on material availability as well as other factors. And that choice reflects efficiency, because it shows that the builders used what was present. The absence of large external structures means that the significance of these tombs is not immediately visible, because much of what defines them is hidden, and that hidden nature changes perception, because it requires entry, exploration. The experience of moving inside is different from being outside. Light fades, sound changes, space becomes enclosed, and that shift creates a distinct environment. And that environment is part of the design. Even now, the tombs remain, carved into the rock. Their interiors still accessible, their forms still intact, allowing them to be entered, observed, studied. And that persistence reflects durability, because carving into solid rock creates structures that resist change. But there are still questions. Because while the function as burial spaces is understood, the full context of their use, the exact rituals, the meanings attached to specific features are not fully preserved, and that leaves space for interpretation. The contrast between external simplicity and internal complexity is what defines these structures. Because from the outside, they appear minimal, but inside they reveal depth, design, structure, and that contrast changes understanding. And maybe that is what makes the Domus de Janas stand out. Not because they rise above the land, but because they exist within it, spaces carved into stone, hidden from view, designed with intention, shaped to create something that is both structural and symbolic. A series of chambers cut into rock, holding what is no longer visible. And that hidden design is what remains. The city carved directly into stone. There are no streets in the usual sense, no separate buildings rising one beside another, no clear divisions that define a modern settlement, only openings in rock, carved spaces, and surfaces shaped into forms that blend into the hillside. But the longer you observe, the more structure appears, because this is not random carving. This is planned. This is uplistica. And what makes it stand out is not just that it is carved into stone, but how extensive that carving is, because this is not a single chamber or a small group of rooms, it is an entire system, a network of spaces shaped directly into the rock, forming something that functions like a city, and that scale changes everything. The terrain itself becomes the foundation, a rock formation rising above the surrounding area, providing elevation, stability, and a base that does not need to be built, only shaped. And that approach reflects efficiency, because instead constructing from materials, the builders worked with what already existed. The spaces within the rock vary: large halls, small rooms, passages connecting different areas, creating a layout that is not uniform but still organized enough to allow movement and function. And that variation reflects planning, because it shows that each space was created with purpose. The entrances to these spaces are carved directly into the rock surface, some wide, some narrow, creating access points that define how each area is reached, controlling movement through the site. And that control is intentional, because it shapes how the city is experienced. The surfaces inside are smooth in many areas, refined, indicating that tools were used to shape the rock carefully, creating spaces that are more than simple cavities, spaces that are structured and usable. And that refinement reflects skill, because carving stone requires precision. The layout follows the natural contours of the rock, spaces arranged at different levels, connected by paths and carved steps, creating vertical as well as horizontal movement. And that verticality adds complexity, because it shows that the city was designed in multiple dimensions. The presence of larger chambers suggests areas of gathering, spaces that could hold multiple individuals, indicating that the site was not only residential, but also communal. And that function adds depth because it shows that the city supported different activities. The integration of the site with the landscape is complete because the structures are not separate from the rock. They are the rock. And that integration creates a sense of permanence because carving into solid stone produces structures that are resistant to change. The positioning of the city also matters because it overlooks surrounding areas, providing visibility, allowing those within to observe movement beyond the immediate space. And that visibility suggests awareness because it shows that location was chosen deliberately. The absence of traditional building materials like brick or timber in many areas emphasizes the method because everything is shaped from the same material, stone, and that uniformity creates consistency because the entire city shares the same foundation. The function of uplistike has multiple interpretations because it appears to have served as a living space, a place of activity, possibly with ceremonial or administrative roles as well, but the exact balance of these functions is not fully defined. And that uncertainty adds depth because it shows that even large, well-defined sites can retain unanswered questions. The passage of time has altered parts of the structure, sections worn down, edges softened, but much of the layout remains, allowing the city to still be understood as a system, and that persistence reflects durability. Even now, the carved spaces remain, rooms still visible, passages still connecting areas, allowing the site to be explored, to be experienced in a way that reflects its original design. And that experience keeps it relevant because it provides direct interaction with the structure. The contrast between natural formation and human shaping is what defines Uplistica. Because the rock existed before the city, but the city transformed it. And that transformation creates something new, a space that is both natural and constructed at the same time. And maybe that is what makes Uplistica stand out. Not because it was built, but because it was carved. A city created by removing material rather than adding it, shaping the landscape into something that functions as both environment and structure. A network of spaces, cut into stone, forming a city within the rock, and that transformation is what remains. The city built with order that still feels modern. Low brick walls, broken outlines of structures. A layout that feels incomplete when seen from ground level, as if only fragments remain of something much larger. But the more you observe, the clearer it becomes. Because this is not random. This is organized. This is Mohenjo-daro. And what makes it stand out is not just its age, but how structured it is. Because this city was planned, not grown randomly, with streets, drainage, and buildings arranged in a way that feels intentional, controlled, and surprisingly systematic. And that level of order changes everything. The streets form a grid, straight lines intersecting at consistent angles, creating blocks that define space clearly, allowing movement to be predictable, structured, easy to navigate. And that kind of planning reflects foresight, because it shows that the layout was decided before construction began. The buildings are made from baked bricks, uniform in size, consistent in shape, allowing walls to be built with precision, creating structures that align with each other, forming a cohesive environment. And that consistency reflects control, because producing uniform materials requires organization. The drainage system is one of the most defining features, because channels run alongside streets, covered in many areas, directing water away from living spaces, managing flow in a way that prevents accumulation. And that system reflects understanding, because it shows awareness of sanitation and water management. Each house connects to this system, with its own access to drainage, indicating that the design was not limited to public space, but extended into private areas, integrating individual structures into a larger network. And that integration is important, because it shows that the city functioned as a system. The presence of wells throughout the city also adds another layer, because access to water is distributed, not centralized, allowing multiple areas to function independently. And that distribution reflects planning, because it ensures availability. The scale of the city is significant, because it extends across a large area containing multiple sections, suggesting that this was not a small settlement but a major urban center. And that scale requires coordination, because building and maintaining something of this size involves organization. The layout includes open spaces, areas that break the grid, creating variation within the structure, suggesting that not all space was used in the same way, that different functions existed within the city, and that variation adds depth, because it shows flexibility. The walls of the buildings are thick, providing insulation, stability, indicating that the structures were designed to last, to support daily life over extended periods, and that durability reflects understanding. The absence of large monumental structures in the traditional sense is notable because the city's significance comes from its layout rather than a single dominant building. And that shifts focus, because it emphasizes system over symbol. The elevated areas within the city suggest zones of importance, raised sections that stand above others, creating hierarchy within the layout, indicating that certain spaces held different roles. And that hierarchy reflects organization, because it shows that space was structured. The reason for the city's decline is not fully understood, because while evidence shows that it was abandoned, the exact causes remain uncertain, whether environmental, social, or a combination of factors. And that uncertainty adds depth, because it shows that even well-developed systems can change. Even now, the layout remains visible, the streets still defined, the drainage still traceable, allowing the city to be studied as a complete system rather than isolated fragments. And that persistence keeps it relevant, because it provides insight into planning at a scale that feels advanced. The contrast between age and design is what stands out most, because despite being ancient, the structure feels familiar, organized in ways that resemble later developments. And that familiarity creates impact, because it challenges expectations. And maybe that is what makes Mohenjo-Daro stand out. Not just because it existed, but because of how it was designed, a city that reflects order, structure, and planning at a level that still feels recognizable. A grid of streets, a network of systems, a city built with intention. And that order is what remains. The stepwell that descends in perfect geometry. A vast geometric pattern carved into the ground, rows upon rows of perfectly aligned steps descending downward in a repeating sequence, forming a shape so precise that it almost feels designed rather than built. But it is built, carefully, deliberately. This is Chand Bowery. And what makes it stand out is not just its depth, but how that depth is structured. Because instead of a simple drop into water, the entire space is organized into layers of steps that create a symmetrical pattern, extending across the walls in a way that feels both functional and visual at the same time. And that combination changes everything. The steps are arranged in a repeating pattern, triangular formations that extend downward, creating a sense of rhythm without becoming decorative, maintaining structure while still forming a striking visual effect. And that repetition reflects precision, because maintaining alignment across such a large structure requires control. The depth of the stepwell is significant, because it extends far below ground level, creating a vertical space that changes temperature, light, and sound as you move downward. And that vertical shift is important, because it creates a transition from open space to enclosed depth. The purpose of the stepwell is practical: water storage, access, a system designed to collect and retain water in an environment where availability can vary. And that function defines the structure, because everything about the design supports it. The steps provide access at different levels, allowing movement downward as water levels change, ensuring that access remains possible regardless of how much water is present, and that adaptability reflects understanding, because it shows awareness of environmental conditions. The symmetry of the structure is not just visual, it contributes to stability, because evenly distributed steps help balance the structure, reducing pressure in any single area, maintaining integrity over time. And that balance reflects planning. The walls are constructed from stone, fitted together to create surfaces that are both strong and precise, supporting the steps while maintaining alignment across the entire structure. And that construction reflects skill, because it shows control over material. The repetition of steps creates a sense of scale, because as the pattern continues downward, it amplifies the depth, making the structure feel larger than it might appear from above. And that perception adds to the experience, because it changes how space is understood. The presence of a pavilion structure at one side introduces contrast, because while the steps are uniform and repetitive, this area adds variation, creating a space that stands apart from the geometric pattern. And that contrast adds complexity, because it shows that the design includes both repetition and variation. The environment also plays a role, because the deeper sections of the stepwell are cooler, creating a microclimate that differs from the surface, suggesting that the structure may have served multiple functions beyond water storage. And that possibility adds depth, because it expands how the structure can be understood. The experience of moving through the stepwell is gradual, descending step by step, light changing, space narrowing, creating a progression that is not immediate but continuous. And that progression is part of the design, because it shapes interaction. The precision of the geometry raises questions, because maintaining such alignment across a large structure requires measurement, planning, methods that ensure consistency, and that level of control reflects knowledge. Even now, the structure remains, the steps still aligned, the depth still visible, allowing the pattern to be observed, to be experienced as it was designed. And that persistence reflects effectiveness, because it shows that the construction methods were durable. The contrast between function and form is what defines Chandbari, because it is built for a practical purpose, but executed with a level of precision that creates something visually striking. And that combination creates impact, because it shows that utility and design can exist together. And maybe that is what makes Chandbari stand out. Not just because it holds water, but because of how it is built. A structure that turns necessity into geometry, creating a space that is both functional and precise. A descent into depth, defined by repetition, shaped by symmetry. And that structure is what remains. The fortress built around a hidden water source. A circular rise in the landscape, low and compact, with stone walls that seem to form a boundary rather than a structure. Something that doesn't immediately reveal what lies inside. But the deeper you look, the more layered it becomes. Because this is not just a fort. It is a system. This is Motia de l'Azuer. And what makes it stand out is not just its defensive appearance, but what it protects. Because at its center lies something more important than walls, access to water. And that changes everything. The outer structure forms a circular enclosure. Walls built from stone, thick, layered, creating a boundary that separates the interior from the surrounding land, controlling movement, defining space. And that boundary reflects intention, because it shows that the structure was designed to protect. Inside the outer wall, additional layers appear. More walls, more divisions, creating a nested design where each layer adds another level of separation, another barrier, forming a structure that is not simple, but progressively controlled. And that layered defense is important, because it shows that protection was a priority. At the center of the structure is a well, deep, extending downward to reach groundwater, providing a consistent source of water even when surface conditions change. And that central feature defines the entire site, because everything around it is built to secure access to it. The depth of the well is significant, because reaching groundwater requires excavation, planning, understanding of where water can be found, indicating that the builders had knowledge of their environment. And that knowledge reflects adaptation, because it shows how the structure responds to conditions. The circular design of the fort also contributes to its function, because it distributes pressure evenly, reduces weak points, and allows for continuous walls without corners that could be more vulnerable, and that choice reflects understanding, because it shows awareness of structural stability. The pathways within the structure are narrow, controlled, guiding movement through specific routes, ensuring that access to the center is limited and regulated. And that control reflects strategy, because it shapes how the space is used. The presence of surrounding areas outside the main structure suggests additional activity, spaces that may have supported living, storage, or other functions, indicating that the fort was not isolated, but part of a larger system. And that connection adds depth, because it shows that the site functioned beyond its core. The use of stone in construction provides durability, allowing the walls to maintain their form over time, even as the environment changes, indicating that the builders chose materials that could withstand conditions. And that choice reflects planning, because it shows that longevity was considered. The structure's position within the landscape also matters, because it is placed in an area where water access would have been critical, suggesting that location was chosen based on necessity. And that necessity defines the structure, because it explains why such effort was invested. The combination of defense and resource management is what makes this site different, because it is not only about protection from external threats, but about securing something essential for survival. And that dual function adds complexity, because it shows that the structure operates on multiple levels. Even now, the remains are visible, the circular walls still defining the space, the central area still marking where the well exists, allowing the structure to be studied, to be understood as a system. And that persistence reflects effectiveness, because it shows that the design worked, but there are still questions. Because while the structure clearly protects water, the full context of how it was used, how it functioned socially, is not fully preserved, and that leaves space for interpretation. The relationship between necessity and design is what defines Motia de l'Azuer, because it shows how a critical resource can shape architecture, how the need for water can lead to the creation of something complex, something layered, something controlled. And maybe that is what makes this site stand out. Not just because it is a fort, but because of what it protects, a structure built not only to defend space, but to secure access to something essential. A circular system, layered with intention, centered around water, and that purpose is what remains. The hidden city said to exist beneath the desert. At first, it sounds like a story. A lost city buried beneath a desert, hidden under layers of sand, described as something that once existed but was never fully documented. Something that appears in fragments rather than clear records. And that's where the uncertainty begins. Because unlike physical ruins that can be visited, measured, and studied directly, this idea exists in pieces, references, and interpretations that don't always align. And that makes it different. This is often described as the lost city beneath the Gobi Desert. And what makes it stand out is not just the idea of a buried settlement, but how it is described, because the references suggest something more complex than a simple ruin, something structured, possibly extensive, but never clearly confirmed. And that lack of confirmation is important, because it defines how the subject is approached. The Gobi Desert itself is vast, expansive, covering large areas where visibility changes constantly, where wind reshapes the surface, where sand can cover and uncover features over time. And that environment makes discovery difficult, because what is visible one moment may not remain visible the next. The idea of structures beneath the desert is not impossible, because shifting landscapes can conceal features, preserving them under layers of material, protecting them from exposure, while also hiding them from view. And that process has been observed in different environments. But in this case, the scale of what is suggested adds complexity, because the descriptions point to something organized, a city, not a single structure, but a system of spaces, implying planning, construction, and use at a level that would require significant effort. And that raises questions, because building something like that requires resources, coordination, and time. The references to a dragon's lair are symbolic, not literal, a way of describing something hidden, something deep beneath the surface, something that is not easily accessed. And that symbolism adds another layer, because it shifts the narrative from physical description to interpretation. The absence of clear archaeological confirmation is what keeps the subject uncertain, because without direct evidence, the idea remains in a space between possibility and speculation. And that space is where it exists. The desert environment contributes to that uncertainty, because it limits long-term visibility, because it changes, because it conceals. And that makes it possible for features to remain hidden, but also difficult to confirm their existence. The concept of a buried city also connects to known patterns, because settlements can be covered over time, layers building above them, preserving structures beneath, creating sites that are only revealed through excavation. And that process is documented, but linking that process to a specific, unconfirmed location introduces complexity, because it requires evidence that is not currently available. The scale of the Gobi makes systematic exploration challenging, because covering such a large area requires resources, time, and methods that can detect what is not visible on the surface. And that limitation contributes to the mystery, because it means that absence of evidence is not always evidence of absence, but it also means that confirmation remains necessary. The balance between possibility and evidence is what defines this subject. Because while the idea of a hidden city is not impossible in general terms, the specific claims associated with it remain unverified. And that distinction matters, because it separates known processes from unconfirmed interpretations. Even so, the persistence of the idea is notable, because it continues to appear, to be discussed, to be referenced. And that persistence reflects interest, because it shows that the concept itself resonates. The desert remains expansive, changing, concealing, allowing the possibility of hidden features while also resisting easy discovery. And that dual nature is what maintains the mystery, because it keeps the question open, not fully answered, not fully dismissed. And maybe that is what makes the idea of the lost city beneath the Gobi stand out. Not because it has been proven, but because it exists in that space between what is known and what is possible. A concept shaped by environment, by interpretation, by the limits of what can currently be confirmed. A hidden structure beneath shifting ground, described but not fully revealed. And that uncertainty is what remains. The city said to be cursed after it was found. At first, it feels like a discovery. A buried city revealed beneath layers of sand, walls emerging from the ground, streets appearing where there was once only desert. A structure that had been hidden, now visible again, and that alone would be enough, because uncovering an entire settlement is not a small event. But this one carries something else, a different kind of attention. Because alongside the discovery came stories. This is often referred to as the lost golden city of Egypt. And what makes it stand out is not just the scale of what was uncovered, but the way it was described afterward. Because reports of unusual events, unexpected patterns, and speculation about a curse began to circulate. And that changes how the discovery is perceived. The city itself shows clear planning, walls, rooms, streets that define movement, suggesting that this was not a temporary settlement, but a structured environment designed for sustained use. And that structure reflects organization, because it shows that the builders had a system. The materials used are consistent with what is known from the region. Mud brick, shaped and arranged to create durable structures that can survive beneath sand for long periods. And that preservation is important, because it allows the city to remain intact even after being buried. The layout of the city reveals division, different areas serving different functions, suggesting that the space was organized to support various activities, creating a system that extends beyond simple habitation. And that organization adds depth, because it shows complexity. The discovery process itself is gradual, because uncovering a buried city does not happen instantly. It requires careful excavation, removing layers of sand, exposing structures step by step. And that process reveals more over time. But it also introduces interpretation, because as new sections are uncovered, new questions appear. The idea of a curse is not part of the physical structure. It is part of how the discovery is understood. Stories that emerge after the fact, often shaped by patterns that are not fully explained. Events that occur around the discovery that are interpreted as connected. And that interpretation adds a layer of perception, because it changes how the site is viewed. Historically, the concept of curses associated with ancient sites is not uncommon, because discoveries often involve disruption of places that were meant to remain sealed, leading to narratives that connect consequences to that disturbance. And that pattern repeats. But distinguishing between narrative and evidence is important, because while the city itself is real, the idea of a curse is not something that can be directly measured or confirmed. And that distinction defines the subject. The preservation of the city beneath sand suggests that the environment acted as protection, because burial can shield structures from erosion, maintaining their form over long periods, allowing them to reappear in a state that reflects their original layout. And that preservation reflects conditions, because it shows how environment influences survival. The scale of the site continues to expand as more is uncovered, because each section reveals additional structure, extending the boundaries of the known area, suggesting that the city is larger than initially visible. And that expansion adds complexity, because it shows that the full extent is still being understood. The absence of complete records about the city's history leaves gaps, because while structures can be observed, the full narrative of how the city functioned, why it was abandoned, is not entirely preserved, and that uncertainty creates space for interpretation. The idea of the city being golden is also symbolic, because it may refer to its significance, its prosperity, or how it is perceived rather than literal material. And that symbolism adds another layer, because it shapes expectation. The contrast between physical evidence and narrative interpretation is what defines this subject. Because the city exists. It can be studied, measured, observed. But the stories that surround it exist in a different space, one shaped by perception, by pattern, by interpretation. And that difference is important. Even now, the site continues to be explored, new sections uncovered, new details revealed, allowing the understanding of the city to evolve over time. And that ongoing process keeps it active, because it is not fully known. The balance between discovery and interpretation is what stands out most, because it shows how a real place can become something more in perception, how evidence and narrative can exist side by side. And maybe that is what makes the Lost Golden City stand out. Not just because it was buried, but because of what followed its discovery, how the physical structure and the stories around it became connected, creating a subject that is both archaeological and interpretive. A city revealed from beneath sand, structured, real, surrounded by stories, and that combination is what remains. The temple carved from a single rock, multiple structures, pillars, courtyards, layers of architecture rising upward, forming something that resembles a built temple, assembled piece by piece over time. But then the perspective shifts, because this was not built upward, it was carved downward. This is the Kailasa temple. And what makes it stand out is not just its scale, but the method used to create it. Because instead of bringing materials together, the entire structure was carved out of a single mass of rock, removing everything that was not part of the final design. And that approach changes everything. The process begins from the top, not the base, which means the builders had to plan the entire structure in advance, knowing exactly what needed to be removed, because mistakes could not be corrected once the material was gone. And that level of planning reflects precision, because it requires foresight. The outer structure appears complete, freestanding, separated from the surrounding rock, yet still part of it, because the temple and the rock it came from are the same material, and that continuity is important, because it shows that the structure is not assembled. It is revealed. The scale of the temple is significant, large enough to contain multiple levels, courtyards, columns, carved details that extend across surfaces, indicating that the work was not limited to basic shaping, but included refinement at every level. And that detail adds complexity, because it shows that the process continued beyond the initial carving. The pillars are aligned, symmetrical, supporting spaces that are open yet defined, creating areas that can be moved through, experienced, used. And that alignment reflects control, because it shows that the structure was not only carved but organized. The surfaces are detailed, carvings that cover walls, adding layers of design that transform the structure from simple form into something more intricate. And that detail reflects skill, because it shows mastery over material. The interior spaces are connected, rooms leading into other rooms, paths guiding movement through the structure, creating a flow that is not random but directed. And that flow reflects planning, because it shows that the builders considered how the space would be used. The removal of material is what defines the process, because instead of constructing, the builders shaped by subtraction, carving away what was not needed, leaving behind only what formed the structure. And that method requires precision at every step, because there is no addition, only removal. The environment around the temple also contributes to its presence, because it sits within the rock from which it was carved, creating a contrast between the carved space and the remaining mass, emphasizing the scale of what was removed. And that contrast adds impact, because it makes the process visible. The time required to create something like this would have been significant, because carving such a large structure from solid rock is not quick. It requires sustained effort, coordination, planning over long periods. And that effort reflects organization, because it shows that the project was maintained over time. The purpose of the temple is connected to ritual and belief, but the exact experience of those who used it, how they interacted with the space in detail, is not fully preserved, and that leaves space for interpretation. Even now, the structure remains. The carved surfaces still visible, the spaces still accessible, allowing it to be observed, to be experienced as both architecture and process. And that persistence reflects durability, because carving into solid rock creates structures that resist change. The contrast between method and result is what defines this temple, because the result appears constructed, but the method is subtractive. And that difference changes the understanding, because it shows that complex structures do not always come from assembly. They can come from removal. And maybe that is what makes the Kailasa temple stand out, not just because of its size, but because of how it was created, a structure that exists not because material was added, but because it was taken away, revealing something that was always there within the rock, a complete structure carved from a single mass. The hidden stone complex deep in the mountains? There are no massive monuments rising above everything, no single structure dominating the skyline, only stone walls, terraces, and pathways that seem to blend into the mountains around them. And that subtlety is important, because this place doesn't reveal itself immediately. This is the Vilcabamba stone complex. And what makes it stand out is not just where it is, but how it exists, because instead of forcing architecture onto the landscape, the structures follow it, adapting to slopes, curves, and elevation, becoming part of the terrain rather than separate from it. And that changes how it is understood. The terrain itself is difficult, steep, uneven, covered in vegetation. Reaching the site requires movement through natural barriers, suggesting that access was never simple, never direct. And that isolation adds another layer, because it implies intention. The stonework is precise, large stones shaped and fitted, together without mortar, forming walls that remain stable through placement alone, creating surfaces that align closely, reducing gaps. And that method reflects understanding, because it shows that strength comes from fit. The terraces are a defining feature. Flat platforms carved into the slopes, creating usable space where none naturally existed, allowing for construction, movement, and possibly cultivation. And that modification of the land reflects planning, because it shows that the environment was shaped to support function. The layout is not rigid. There is no perfect grid. Instead, structures are placed according to the terrain, following natural contours, creating a system that feels organic but still controlled. And that balance is important, because it shows flexibility in design. The pathways connecting different parts of the complex are narrow, carefully placed, guiding movement through the site, linking terraces, structures, and open spaces, indicating that circulation was considered. And that consideration reflects organization, because it shows that movement was part of the design. The location within the mountains provides natural advantages. Visibility over surrounding areas, control over access points, protection through terrain rather than walls alone. And that integration reflects strategy, because it shows that the environment was used as part of the system. Water sources nearby would have been essential, because sustaining activity in such a location requires access to water, suggesting that the site supported long-term use rather than temporary occupation. And that continuity matters, because it shows that the complex functioned over time. The scale of the site is not defined by a single structure, but by many, interconnected elements forming a network rather than a focal point, indicating that the importance lies in the system as a whole. And that distributed design adds depth, because it shows that the site that is not centered around one feature. The materials used are local, stone sourced from the surrounding area, shaped and placed to create structures that align with the environment, reflecting efficiency, because it shows that the builders worked with what was available. The purpose of the complex is not fully defined, because while the structures are visible, the exact roles they served, whether primarily residential, strategic, or ceremonial, are not completely preserved. And that uncertainty adds depth, because it leaves space for interpretation. Even now, the complex remains partially hidden, blending into the landscape. Stone walls still visible, terraces still defining space, but much of it requiring attention to fully recognize. And that subtle presence keeps it understated, because it does not immediately reveal its scale. The relationship between structure and environment is what defines this site, because it shows how architecture can exist within nature rather than against it, how design can adapt rather than impose. And maybe that is what makes the Vilcabamba stone complex stand out, not because it dominates the landscape, but because it disappears into it, a system built with awareness of terrain, of movement, of space.